security assistance.
Yes, sir.
And so even though President Trump was saying repeatedly that there is no quid pro quo, Ambassador Sondland relayed to you that the facts of the matter were that the White House meeting and the security assistance were conditioned on the announcement of these investigations. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding.
Now, you reference a television interview and a desire for President Trump to put Zelensky in a public box, which you also have in quotes. Was that in your notes?
It was in my notes.
And what did you understand that to mean, to put Zelensky in a public box?
I understood that to mean that President Trump, through Ambassador Sondland, was asking for President Zelensky to very publicly commit to these investigations, that it was not sufficient to do this in private, that this needed to be a very public statement.
And did you understand why it was needed to be in public as opposed to a private confirmation?
No further information on that.
Now, during this time period in early September, did you come to understand that from your conversations with the Ukrainians or other individuals that Ukraine felt pressure to initiate these investigations because of the conditionality of the White House meeting and the security assistance?
Mr. Goldman, here's what I know. I got several questions. Other officials got several questions as well from Ukrainians asking about the security assistance. So what I know is the security assistance was very important to the Ukrainians. They had begun to hear from Ambassador Sondland that the security assistance was not going to come until the investigations were pursued. What I heard from the defense minister, what the senators, what Senator Johnson and Senator Murphy heard in their conversation with President Zelensky was the clear concern, the urgent concern that Ukrainians had about the security assistance.
Now, you also described a conversation that you had with Ambassador Sondland a week later on September 8th. And in that conversation, in your opening statement, you described how Ambassador Sondland used the term stalemate. What did you understand the concern about a stalemate to be?
Ambassador Sondland said that if President Zelensky did not clear things up in public, we would be at a stalemate. He began that, again, by repeating, this is not a quid pro quo, but if President Zelensky did not clear things up in public, we would be at a stalemate. And what I understood in that meeting, the meaning of stalemate was the security assistance would not come.
So even though he said the words, there were no quid pro quo, he then went on to say, but the security assistance will not come unless these investigations are done. Is that what you're saying?
My understanding, that's what was meant by stalemate.
You also described in your opening statement a discussion you had about President Trump being a businessman who wanted to have people pay up before signing the check. And what did you understand that to mean?
This was an explanation that Ambassador Sondland gave me about his understanding of President Trump's thought process. Ambassador Sondland is a businessman. President Trump's a businessman. He was explaining to me the relationship, the understanding that a businessman would have when he was about to sign a check. And by that, he clearly meant that President Trump was thinking about or had in front of him the possibility of providing security assistance to Ukraine. It was similar to writing a check to someone who you're about to send. He used that analogy very clearly to indicate that this would require something. If that person owed him something before he signed the check, he wanted to get whatever he was owed paid back to him. And Ambassador Volker used very similar language about a week later, which indicates to me that they had that conversation as well.
Did Ukraine owe anything to the United States?
Ms. Goldman, they didn't. They owed appreciation for the support, and they were getting support, and they appreciated that. But there was nothing owed to President Trump on that.
But you understood the upshot of this comment made by both Ambassador Sondland and Ambassador Volker to be that President Trump believed that Ukraine owed him something personally. Is that accurate?
It's hard to understand, but there was a feeling by President Trump that he, and this came out in the transcript. I'm sorry, this came out in the discussion with the inaugural delegation when they came back to have a conversation with President Trump on May 23rd, that he had a feeling of having been wronged by the Ukrainians. And so this was something that he thought they owed him to fix that wrong.
Right, but what he was talking about, as you understood it, because in the context of the conversation, is that what he owed him were these investigations that he wanted.
That right? Would have been to fix the wrong, exactly.
And those investigations into the 2016 election and Biden and Burisma.
That's correct.
Now, during this early period in September, we've talked a little bit about the fact that you continually heard that the president was repeatedly saying that there was no quid pro quo. Is that right?
That's correct.
And he still says that repeatedly today. But regardless of what you call it, whether it's a quid pro quo, bribery, extortion, abuse of power of the office of the presidency, the fact of the matter, as you understood it, is that security assistance and the White House meeting were not going to be provided unless Ukraine initiated these two investigations that would benefit Donald Trump's reelection. Is that what you understood the facts to be?
Mr. Goldman, what I can do here for you today is tell you what I heard from people. And in this case, it was what I heard from Ambassador Sondland. He described conditions for the security assistance and the White House meeting in those terms. That is, that were dependent upon, conditioned on pursuing these investigations.
And you heard that from Ambassador Sondland himself, correct?
Correct.
And you also heard a similar story from Mr. Morrison as well, is that right?
Who also talked to Ambassador Sondland about the conversations that he had had in Warsaw with Ukrainians.
And what Mr. Morrison recounted to you was substantially similar to what Mr. Sondland recounted to you, right?
Yes.
And so regardless of what Ukrainians may say now that everything is out in the public and we're here in this public hearing, that they felt no pressure from President Trump, it was your clear understanding, was it not, that in early September, when the pressure campaign was still secret, that the Ukrainians believed that they needed to announce these public investigations? Is that right?
Ms. Goldman, I know that the Ukrainians were very concerned about the security assistance. And I know that they were prepared or preparing to make a public statement, that is, with a CNN interview, that was being planned. Those are the two pieces that I know.
And that CNN interview was to announce these investigations as you understood it, right?
That was the implication. That was certainly the implication.
We've been focused a lot on the September timeframe, but I want to go back 2 months to July, before the July 25th call. And you testified, Ambassador Taylor, in your opening statement that it was in the middle of July when you understood that the White House meeting was first a condition on these investigations. Is that accurate?
Yes, we were preparing, and I agreed that the White House meeting was going to be an important step in U.S.-Ukrainian relations. So in June and in early July, attempts to work out a way to get that meeting included a phone call. And so there were several conversations about how to have this phone call that eventually happened on July 25th.
And you described in your opening statement a July 10th White House meeting with a number of officials where Ambassador Bolton used the term that something was a drug deal. What did you understand him to mean in hearing that he said that, used this term drug deal?
Ms. Goldman, I don't know. I don't know what Ambassador Bolton had in mind.
And was that in reference to a discussion in that meeting related to the White House meeting that President Zelensky wanted and in connection to the investigations?
The context of that comment was the discussion that Mr. Daniluk, who was Mr. Bolton's counterpart, Ukrainian counterpart, the National Security Advisor, had with Mr. Bolton. And that conversation was very substantive up until the point where the White House meeting was raised and Ambassador Sondland intervened to talk about the investigations. It was at that point that Ambassador Bolton ceased the meeting, closed the meeting, finished the meeting, and told his staff to report this meeting to the lawyers. And he also later then indicated to Fiona Hill, who was also a participant on NSC staff, that he, Ambassador Bolton, didn't want to be associated with this drug deal. So it was, the implication was it was the domestic politics that was being cooked up.
And did Ambassador Sondland say this in front of the Ukrainian officials, to your understanding?
Ambassador Sondland, in the meeting where Ambassador Bolton was having a conversation with his counterpart, raised the issue of investigations being important to come before the White House meeting that had just been raised.
And Ukrainian officials were there?
And Ukrainian officials were in that meeting, yes, sir.
Now, around this same time, in mid-July, did you have any discussions with Ukrainian officials about these investigations?
I don't recall.
Well, let me show you a text message that you wrote on July 21st, where you wrote it again to Ambassadors Sondland and Volker. And if you could just read what you wrote here on July 21st.
Gordon, one thing Kurt and I talked about yesterday was Sasha Daniluk's point that President Zelensky is sensitive about Ukraine being taken seriously, not merely as an instrument in Washington domestic re-election politics.
And Sasha Daniluk, I think you just said, is Ambassador Bolton's counterpart, right?
He's the National Security Advisor to the, it was, he's no longer, but was at the time.
What did you understand it to mean when that Zelensky had concerns about being an instrument in Washington domestic re-election politics?
Mr. Daniluk understood that these investigations were pursuant to Mr. Giuliani's request to develop information, to find information about Burisma and the Bidens. This was very well known in public. Mr. Giuliani had made this point clear in several instances in the beginning, in the springtime. And Mr. Daniluk was aware that that was a problem.
And would you agree that because President Zelensky is worried about this, they understood at least that there was some pressure for them to pursue these investigations? Is that fair?
Mr. Daniluk indicated that President Zelensky certainly understood it, that he did not want to get involved in these